The morning rain drummed against the windows of Gatcombe Park as Princess Anne sat in her study, methodically working through the day's correspondence. At 73, the Princess Royal maintained the same disciplined routine she had followed for decades. Her desk was organized with military precision, each document in its designated place, her fountain pen moving with practiced efficiency across official papers. Her private secretary had already sorted the Morning Post into 3 neat piles: official business, charitable matters, and personal correspondence. Anne preferred to handle her mail personally rather than delegate everything to staff. She believed in maintaining direct contact with the organizations and people who wrote to her, a habit that had served her well throughout her decades of public service. The rain intensified as she reached for the next envelope in the pile. It was cream-colored, expensive paper, with her name written in elegant handwriting across the front. What caught her attention immediately was the word urgent, written in red ink in the upper right corner. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet something about it seemed oddly formal, almost archaic in its style. Anne turned the envelope over and found no return address, no official seal, and no indication of who might have sent it. This was unusual. Most of her correspondence came through official channels or from well-established contacts who always identified themselves clearly. Security protocols at royal residences meant that anonymous mail rarely reached the family members directly. She reached for her letter opener, a silver piece that had belonged to her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother. The envelope opened cleanly, revealing a single sheet of matching cream paper. As she unfolded it, Anne noticed the paper felt heavier than usual, almost like parchment. The message was brief but immediately alarming. Your Royal Highness. Information has come to light regarding events at Balmoral in September that were not made public. The official reports contained significant omissions. Your mother's final days involved circumstances that the family was not told about. Evidence exists that could change everything the public believes about those final moments. This concerns matters of national importance that go beyond personal grief. You must act quickly. Time is running short for the truth to emerge. A trusted contact will reach out within 48 hours with proof. Tell no one except those you trust completely. The monarchy's future may depend on how this information is handled. The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom was a small symbol that made Anne's blood run cold. It was the thistle and rose emblem, the same symbol that had appeared on certain documents during the most sensitive royal matters throughout history. This was not something an outsider would know about or be able to replicate easily. Anne read the message 3 more times, her hands trembling slightly. The reference to Balmoral in September could only mean one thing: her mother's death. Queen Elizabeth II had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle on September 8, surrounded by family. The public had been told she died quietly in her sleep after a brief illness. But this letter suggested there was more to the story. The Princess Royal was known for her pragmatic nature and her skepticism of conspiracy theories. She had spent her entire life dealing with rumors, speculation, and sensationalized stories about the royal family. Most could be dismissed without a second thought. But this felt different. The formal tone, the specific details, and especially that symbol at the bottom, suggested this was not the work of a crank or attention seeker. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain cascade down the glass. Her mind raced through the events of that September day. She had been one of the first family members to reach Balmoral when they received word that the Queen's condition had deteriorated. She remembered the somber atmosphere in the castle, the quiet efficiency of the medical staff, and the peaceful way her mother had slipped away. But now, thinking back, there had been some things that seemed unusual at the time. Certain staff members had been unusually quiet, almost secretive. There had been whispered conversations that stopped when family members approached. And she remembered thinking it odd that some of the Queen's regular personal staff had been dismissed early that day, replaced by people she didn't recognize. Anne had attributed these oddities to the natural tension and emotion surrounding such a significant moment. Royal protocol during times of crisis always involved additional security measures and changes to normal routines. She had not thought to question any of it at the time. The letter mentioned evidence and proof. What kind of evidence could exist about those final days? And more importantly, Who would have access to such information? The number of people present at Balmoral during the Queen's final hours had been very limited: family members, essential medical staff, and a small number of trusted household members. Each of these individuals had been vetted extensively over years of service. Anne found herself thinking about the phrase, "matters of national importance." What could possibly have happened during her mother's final days that would rise to that level? The Queen had been the constitutional monarch for over 70 years. Every aspect of her final illness and death had implications for the succession, the government, and the Commonwealth realms. She returned to her desk and picked up the letter again. The paper still felt unusual in her hands, and she noticed now that it had a faint watermark when held to the light. The watermark appeared to be a crown, but not the standard royal crown she was familiar with. This was something older, more ornate. The 48-hour time frame mentioned in the letter created an immediate sense of urgency. If someone was going to contact her with proof of whatever this was about, she needed to decide how to handle it. The letter specifically mentioned telling only those she trusted completely. In her position, that was a very short list indeed. Her first instinct was to contact palace security and have them investigate the source of the letter. But the warning about discretion gave her pause. If there really was something sensitive involved, premature disclosure could cause enormous damage. On the other hand, if this was an elaborate hoax or blackmail attempt, she could be walking into a trap. Anne had always prided herself on her ability to handle difficult situations with calm judgment. During her decades of public service, she had dealt with protests, threats, attempted kidnappings, and numerous crises with remarkable composure. But this felt different because it touched on something so personal and sacred: her mother's final moments. She thought about her brother Charles, now King Charles III. Should she tell him about the letter immediately? As the monarch, he would need to know about anything that could affect the crown. But the letter's emphasis on discretion made her hesitate. What if telling Charles triggered a series of events that could not be controlled? Then she thought about William. As heir to the throne, he had a stake in anything that could impact the monarchy's reputation or stability. But he was also dealing with his own responsibilities and the enormous pressure of his new role as Prince of Wales. Adding this uncertainty to his already heavy burden seemed cruel without knowing more about what was really involved. The rain continued to pound against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. Anne realized she was facing one of the most difficult decisions of her life. Every choice carried enormous risks, both personal and institutional. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her personal safe, the one that contained her most private documents and family papers. Whatever she decided to do next, she needed to keep this information completely secure until she knew more. As she locked the safe, Anne made her decision. She would wait for the promised contact within the 48-hour window, but she would also begin her own quiet investigation into the events at Balmoral that September day. If there really was something the family had not been told, she was determined to uncover the truth, regardless of the consequences. The Princess Royal had spent her entire life serving the crown and protecting her family's legacy. Now, it seemed, that dedication was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined possible. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and careful investigation. Princess Anne went about her scheduled activities with her usual professional demeanor, but her mind kept returning to the mysterious letter. She attended a charity luncheon in Cheltenham, reviewed plans for upcoming engagements, and hosted a reception for representatives from Save the Children. To everyone around her, she appeared completely normal. But internally, she was consumed with questions about what she might learn. During quiet moments between appointments, Anne began making discreet inquiries about the events at Balmoral. She called her brother Andrew under the pretext of discussing estate matters, carefully steering the conversation toward their mother's final days. Andrew mentioned feeling that some things had seemed off during that time, but attributed it to the emotional weight of the situation. She also reached out to her cousin Peter Phillips, who had been at Balmoral briefly during that period. Peter recalled seeing unfamiliar faces among the staff, people he didn't recognize from previous visits to the Scottish estate. When he had asked about them, he was told they were additional medical consultants brought in to assist with the Queen's care. But Peter found it strange that these consultants seemed to spend more time in meetings than at the Queen's bedside. The most unsettling conversation was with her lady-in-waiting, Dame Sarah Richardson, who had served the royal household for over 20 years. Sarah confided that she had been asked to leave Balmoral 2 days before the Queen's death, told that her services would not be needed during the final phase of the Queen's illness. This was unprecedented. Sarah had been with the Queen during every major illness and health scare for 2 decades. Her dismissal had felt abrupt and unexplained. As the second day wore on, Anne found herself checking her phone constantly, waiting for the promised contact. The letter had specified 48 hours, and that deadline was approaching rapidly. She had cleared her evening schedule, claiming she needed time for personal matters, and was waiting in her study when her mobile phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. The voice on the other end was elderly but clear, with a slight Scottish accent. The caller identified himself only as a friend of your mother's and said he had been instructed to contact her at this precise time. He told Anne that what he had to share could not be discussed over the phone and requested a face-to-face meeting at a location where they could speak privately. Anne's security training kicked in immediately. Meeting an unknown contact at an undisclosed location violated every protocol she had learned over decades of public life. But something in the man's voice, a quality of genuine grief and respect when he mentioned her mother, convinced her that this was not a typical security threat. They arranged to meet the following afternoon at the Caerphilly Castle ruins in Wales, a location that would allow them to speak privately while remaining in a public space where Anne would be relatively safe. The caller suggested she bring William, saying that what he had to share would ultimately require the future king's involvement. After ending the call, Anne sat in her study for a long time, weighing her options. The smart, safe choice would be to report this entire incident to palace security and let them handle whatever was developing. But her instincts told her that this matter was too sensitive for the standard security apparatus. If there really was a cover-up involving her mother's death, it might involve people currently in positions of trust within the royal household. Finally, at nearly midnight, she made the call that would change everything. William answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Anne had always had a special relationship with her nephew, appreciating his steady character and clear judgment. If anyone could help her navigate this crisis, it would be him. William, I need you to come to Gatcombe Park tomorrow morning. Something has come up that requires your immediate attention. I cannot explain over the phone, but it concerns your grandmother and matters that could affect the crown. The Prince of Wales agreed without hesitation, hearing the unusual tension in his aunt's voice. He promised to arrive by 10 o'clock and to keep the visit completely confidential. Anne could hear Catherine's voice in the background, asking if everything was all right. William assured his wife that he would explain later, after he understood the situation himself. That night, Anne barely slept. She kept thinking about her mother's final days, replaying every conversation and interaction, looking for signs she might have missed. The Queen had seemed peaceful in her final hours, surrounded by family and apparently free from pain. But there had been moments when she seemed to be trying to say something, times when she looked directly at Anne with an intensity that suggested urgency. At the time, Anne had assumed her mother was simply processing the reality of her approaching death, perhaps trying to communicate final thoughts or feelings. Now, she wondered if there had been something more specific the Queen was trying to convey, something important that she had been unable to express clearly in her weakened state. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Anne's somber mood. She was reviewing the mysterious letter one final time when William arrived, looking concerned and slightly puzzled. His usual easy demeanor was replaced by the focused attention he reserved for serious royal business. Aunt Anne, what's this about? Your message last night was quite cryptic. She handed him the letter without preamble, watching his expression change as he read through the allegations. William's face grew increasingly grave, and he read the message twice before looking up at Anne with a mixture of shock and skepticism. This is extraordinary. Do you believe it's credible? Anne shared the results of her discreet inquiries over the past 2 days, including the odd dismissal of longtime staff, the presence of unfamiliar medical personnel, and the general sense that something had been deliberately concealed from the family. William listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "If this is true, it represents a massive breach of trust," William said finally. "But if it's false, we're being manipulated by someone with access to very sensitive information and the ability to forge convincing documents." They discussed their options at length. William's initial instinct was to involve palace security immediately, but Anne convinced him to wait until after they met with the mysterious contact. If there really was evidence of a cover-up, they needed to understand its scope before triggering official investigations that might alert the wrong people. The drive to Wales was tense and quiet. William had arranged for a single protection officer to accompany them, someone he trusted completely. They told the officer only that they were conducting a sensitive family matter that required discretion. Anne carried the original letter in her handbag, along with a small recording device she had decided to bring as insurance. Caerphilly Castle was nearly deserted on the overcast Wednesday afternoon. A few tourists wandered among the ruins, but most areas of the sprawling medieval site were empty. Anne and William made their way to the designated meeting spot near the Great Hall, their protection officer maintaining a discreet distance that allowed for privacy while ensuring their safety. The elderly man who approached them looked exactly as his voice had suggested: dignified, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had spent his life in service to institutions larger than himself. He was perhaps 80 years old, with white hair and keen blue eyes that immediately focused on Anne, with obvious recognition and respect. "Your Royal Highness," he said, bowing slightly to Anne before turning to William. "Your Royal Highness. I am Professor Malcolm Stewart, and I served your grandmother in various capacities for over 30 years. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I believe you have the right to know the truth about Her late Majesty's final days." Professor Stewart reached into his coat and withdrew a manila envelope, much thicker than the original letter Anne had received. His hands shook slightly as he held it, and Anne could see the profound emotional weight this meeting carried for him. "Your grandmother discovered something in her final weeks that deeply disturbed her. She had been conducting her own discreet investigation into certain financial irregularities that had come to her attention through her role as head of state. What she found suggested corruption at the highest levels of government, involving people she had trusted for decades." The professor paused, clearly struggling with the magnitude of what he was revealing. William stepped closer, his expression intense and focused. The Queen realized that her discovery put her in danger. She also realized that it put the entire royal family at risk. The information she had uncovered could have destabilized the government and potentially the Commonwealth itself. She made the incredibly difficult decision to share this information with a small group of trusted advisors, of which I was one. He handed the envelope to Anne, who accepted it with trembling hands. "That envelope contains copies of the documents your grandmother discovered, along with her own notes about their implications. She was working on a plan to expose the corruption while protecting the monarchy from the fallout. But time ran out." Professor Stewart's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I believe Her late Majesty's death was not as natural as it appeared. The timing was too convenient for too many people. The evidence is circumstantial, but troubling. She knew too much, and there were people in positions of power who could not afford to let that information become public." The weight of this revelation hit Anne and William simultaneously. If what Professor Stewart was suggesting was true, their mother and grandmother had been murdered to prevent the exposure of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of British government. The drive back from Wales was conducted in complete silence. Anne clutched the manila envelope containing the documents Professor Stewart had given them, while William stared out at the countryside, rolling past their windows. Both were processing the enormous implications of what they had learned. The professor's revelations had shattered their understanding of their mother's and grandmother's final days, replacing peaceful family memories with the specter of conspiracy and murder. They had arranged to return to Gatcombe Park, where they could examine the documents in complete privacy. William had dismissed their protection officer for the remainder of the day, telling him only that they needed several hours for private family discussions. Once inside Anne's study with the doors securely locked, they spread the contents of the envelope across her desk. The first document was in the Queen's own handwriting, her familiar, elegant script filling several pages of her personal stationery. Reading her grandmother's words, William felt as though she was speaking to him from beyond the grave, urgently trying to convey information she had risked her life to uncover. The Queen had discovered financial irregularities in accounts managed by the Treasury that suggested massive embezzlement of public funds. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of millions of pounds that had been systematically diverted from various government programs over a period of nearly 2 decades. But what made the discovery even more shocking was the identity of the people involved. Among the names mentioned in the Queen's notes were the Chancellor of the Exchequer, 2 senior members of Parliament, the head of the National Audit Office, and most devastatingly, the Queen's own private secretary, Sir Marcus Whitfield, who had served in that position for over 15 years. Sir Marcus had apparently used his access to royal accounts and his knowledge of government financial procedures to facilitate the embezzlement scheme. The second set of documents contained bank records, transaction logs, and correspondence that supported the Queen's allegations. Anne recognized the meticulous way her mother had organized the evidence, the same systematic approach she had applied to every aspect of her constitutional duties. These were not the wild theories of a conspiracy theorist, but the carefully researched findings of someone with unparalleled access to the machinery of British government. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a series of encrypted emails between Sir Marcus and the Chancellor discussing the need to manage the Crown's curiosity and ensure institutional stability. The implication was clear. They had been aware that the Queen was investigating their activities and had been taking steps to prevent her from exposing them. William picked up another document, a medical report that made both siblings go cold. It was an independent autopsy analysis commissioned by Professor Stewart after the Queen's death, conducted by a pathologist with no connections to the Royal Medical Team. The analysis suggested the presence of traces of a rare plant toxin in tissue samples, amounts so small they would not have been detected by standard post-mortem procedures. The toxin, derived from a plant native to Scotland, would have caused symptoms identical to natural cardiac failure in elderly patients. Its presence would not have been suspicious unless specifically tested for, and such tests were rarely conducted when an elderly patient died of apparent natural causes. But the timing and circumstances made its presence highly suspicious. Anne set down the document with shaking hands. She was murdered. Our mother was actually murdered to prevent her from exposing this corruption. William nodded grimly. And the people responsible are still in positions of power. Sir Marcus is still the King's private secretary. The Chancellor is still managing the country's finances. They've been operating freely for months while we mourned our grandmother, never suspecting that her death was anything but natural. They spent the next several hours reviewing every document in the envelope. Professor Stewart had included detailed biographical information about each person implicated in the conspiracy, along with evidence of their involvement in the embezzlement scheme. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking, involving not just financial crimes but abuse of power, manipulation of government contracts, and systematic theft of public resources. Most troubling was the realization that the conspiracy had roots going back nearly 2 decades, meaning it had operated successfully under both Conservative and Labour governments. This was not a partisan political scandal, but a deeper institutional corruption that transcended normal political boundaries. As evening approached, Anne and William faced the enormous challenge of deciding what to do with this information. They could not simply turn it over to normal law enforcement channels, since they had no way of knowing how far the corruption extended or who else might be compromised. At the same time, they could not ignore evidence of their mother's murder, or allow the conspirators to continue operating freely. "We need to bring Charles into this," William said finally. "He's the king now, and Sir Marcus is his private secretary. He has the right to know that someone in his inner circle was involved in our mother's death." Anne agreed, but she was deeply concerned about how to approach her brother with such devastating information. Charles had been struggling with the enormous pressures of his new role as monarch, and learning that his mother had been murdered by trusted advisors would be emotionally crushing. Yet there was no alternative. The king needed to know the truth about his mother's death and the ongoing threat to the monarchy. They agreed to meet with Charles the following morning at Clarence House, away from the usual scrutiny of Buckingham Palace. Anne would contact Charles that evening and request the private meeting without explaining the reasons over the phone. They would present all the evidence together and help Charles decide on the appropriate response. That night, Anne made the most difficult phone call of her life. she reached Charles at Highgrove, where he was spending a quiet evening reviewing state papers. Without going into details, she told him that urgent information had come to light regarding their mother's death that required his immediate attention. Charles agreed to meet with her and William the next morning, clearly concerned by the serious tone of her voice. After ending the call, Anne sat alone in her study, staring at the documents spread across her desk. Professor Stewart had risked everything to bring this information to light, motivated by his loyalty to the Queen and his belief that the truth needed to be revealed. Now that responsibility was passing to her and William, and ultimately to Charles as the reigning monarch. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, a marked contrast to the storm clouds that had dominated the weather during their investigation. Anne and William arrived at Clarence's house carrying a locked briefcase containing all the evidence. They were shown to Charles's private study, a comfortable room filled with his books and personal photographs. When Charles entered the room, his expression immediately grew concerned at seeing both his sister and nephew looking so serious. Anne wasted no time with pleasantries, explaining that they had received information about their mother's death that he needed to see immediately. As Charles read through the Queen's handwritten notes, his face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a cold fury that Anne had rarely seen from her traditionally mild-mannered brother. When he reached the medical analysis suggesting their mother had been poisoned, his hands began to tremble. "Sir Marcus," Charles said quietly, his voice filled with pain and betrayal, "I trusted him completely. Mother trusted him. He was with us during some of our most private family moments, and all the time he was part of a conspiracy to steal from the Crown and the British people." William shared Professor Stewart's theory that the Queen's investigation had put her in danger, and that her death had been timed to prevent her from exposing the corruption. Charles listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions but mostly absorbing the magnitude of what he was learning. The most difficult moment came when they discussed the implications for his reign. If the corruption extended as far as the evidence suggested, Charles would need to conduct a complete review of everyone in positions of trust within the royal household and the government officials with whom the monarchy regularly interacted. The investigation would likely become public, potentially causing a constitutional crisis. But Charles's response surprised both Anne and William. Rather than being paralyzed by the complexity of the situation, he seemed to find strength in finally understanding the truth about his mother's death. The grief that had consumed him for months was being transformed into a determination to honor her memory by completing the investigation she had started. Mother died trying to protect the integrity of the institutions she had served for over 70 years, Charles said firmly. The least we can do is finish what she started, regardless of the cost to ourselves or the monarchy. They spent the remainder of the morning developing a plan to expose the corruption while protecting the stability of the government and the Commonwealth. Charles would discreetly remove Sir Marcus from his position, using the pretext of wanting to reorganize his household staff. Simultaneously, they would contact trusted allies in law enforcement and the intelligence services to begin building criminal cases against the conspirators. The process would be delicate and dangerous. The people involved had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets. But with the evidence the Queen had gathered and Professor Stewart's additional research, they had a real chance of achieving justice for their mother while protecting the future of the monarchy. As they prepared to leave Clarence's house, Charles made a promise that would guide everything that followed. Mother spent her entire life serving this country with absolute integrity. The people who betrayed that service and caused her death will face justice. I swear that on her memory and on the crown she left to me. The investigation that followed would take months and require extraordinary courage from everyone involved. But the Queen's final investigation would ultimately expose one of the largest corruption scandals in British history, and justice would finally be served for a remarkable woman who had died protecting the institutions she loved.